Hey, Svetlana.
Hello, Arne.
It is nice to see you again. It is saddening me, though, that I see an endgame on the board. This looks quite tough.
It's just a rook endgame. It's nothing to be worried about. We'll be looking at some rook endgame principles today.
Oh,
We
okay.
have had one, I think, rook endgame lesson in the past, but it was more in another direction. We were looking at some specific types of them, and this time is going to be a bit different, where we're focusing more on the general principles that you can apply to other rook endgames too.
Okay.
It's not going to be that complicated, so don't worry about it.
I am worried still. I can try to soothe this and say everything is fine, but I'm massively worried. But okay, let's go for it. So, for you at home, if you have just found this video on YouTube because it happens more often, look into the description, please. There's a link to the ChessBase article, and there you can see a board with this position right here. Oh, right there, sorry. Left, right. And you can download it as a PGN. You can upload it on ChessBase. You can play while we are talking and analyze it on your own. But this is a lesson. Take this lesson. Svitlana is doing coaching since many, many years, and Svitlana Smart Moves is a very successful show here. So take your exercise, take your chess lessons, and let's get better in chess all together. Okay, that was it for me. And yeah, by the way, if you want to like this video, feel free to do so. I give you 2 seconds now to just like there. That will be helping tremendously. Yeah, there. Okay, that's it. Okay, thanks.
That's it from you. Now I want you to tell me about the position, about what kinds of rook endgame principles have you heard of? What do you think we usually follow in these type of endgames? Just some general things that you've heard before that you think would help here too.
So often enough, I hear from Carsten Müller, our endgame expert, that rook endgames are very often considered draw. And
Right.
that's in the nature of the rooks because they have a lot of space, they can get the pawns, etc., etc. Now, another principle is, I think it doesn't apply to only one rook, but there is king safety is quite important if there's more than one rook and maybe even a queen there. That's actually one of the most important things in an endgame. And of course, then there's the pawn structure, which plays a role. So if they're connected pawns, if there are weaknesses, we can try to tackle the weaknesses. And the king has to be active too, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically, you summarize it. I think the most important one would probably be your piece activity, not only the rook activity, but also the king activity. So when it's only one rook for each side, you don't really have to worry about the king's safety.
Yeah.
Well, you do if you're getting checkmated and if you got pushed away to the corner of the board, but most of the time that's why you want to activate your king, and the king activity is pretty much just as important as the rook activity. You can even say that the king is like worth as much as a rook in an endgame. A good king can be.
Makes sense, yeah.
Both of these rook activity and king activity would be pretty much the decisive factors of who tries to play for the win, even if objectively maybe the computer can make a draw in a lot of these rook endgames. In practice, people lose and win them all the time, depending on who applies these rules and principles better. So one of these is going to be about king activity and about the rook activity. Here you can clearly see that white has the better rook activity compared to black. And this example will also have another principle, which is called the principle of two weaknesses, which I think you have heard before.
Yeah, that we took in one of the lessons. You can see also the playlist in the description. Take a look at the two weaknesses. Norma, I think we even had it in the title. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, we had it. We might have had it more in the middle game, or also in the end game. So it applies to both middle games and end games, even more so to end games. And it's a useful way to play for a win when the opponent has one weakness. You want to try to create another one to make sure that he can't just stand in one place and try to make a draw as easily. You try to attack both and see if hopefully one of them will fall. So in this beginning position, how would you continue here as white, and what would be your plan of attack?
Yeah, so I would try to activate my king as far as possible. A plan would be to tackle the weaknesses c6, a6, and I also maybe have in mind, if everything fails, that h7 or the one of the pawns, f7, h7, and then maybe later g6 might become a weakness too.
Right. That's a really good idea. So activating the king is the best
Yeah.
thing to do here. If you were going to go for the other pawn and force the rook here, this would be a wrong plan to follow, because rook activity matters more than the amount of pawns. So black would have given up that weak pawn, and something like this now turns to be more drawish than ever winning, because the pawn is really, really far advanced, and you're not going to have as much piece activity as white, and you just gave away counterplay to the opponent. So that's why activating the king is a better idea here. So the game went on. This is a game between Floor and Vidmar back in the 1936. So it was from a while ago, but that's how we get some of the classic rook endgames that we learned from today. So now that we came to the center where we wanted to get in the first place, it's like our rook is not threatened. We're not allowing c5, which is pretty important for the opponent's activation. And we have the weak a6 pawn. So the thing is, even though c6 was our weakness at the beginning, now the king is there. We're not attacking it anymore. So we don't have that weakness to think about anymore. So that slowly faded away from being a weakness, and we only pretty much have one under attack right now. So we're going to want to try to create a second one when we can. So what would be your next plan? It doesn't have to be about like winning a pawn right away, but how would you play this position next? Because this requires some patience too.
Yeah, this is getting a bit more difficult. Now, I think... So, first of all, I noticed that the rook is quite stuck on a8 for black, which is good for us. So we do not have to worry about too many things. So one thing in mind, but it looks amateur and it looks wrong. But one thing I have in mind is b4 and getting the rook down to a3 and out of the situation. But I could also get the rook out of there with c5 and then again
b4 is actually right, but not for that reason.
Oh, okay. The main reason is to avoid c5, of course.
Right. So not only it forever closes down c5, you're just gaining more space on this side of the board, and in endgames that can play a role, later on. What if you end up winning one of the pawns and then your pawns are more advanced, So that's kind of why you do it, to limit the opponent's activity, and also for that future prospect of what if we ever trade into a pawn endgame, then this extra space can actually be more important. But it's just for space, a useful waiting move, preventing c5 if anything, if the rook moves. But the rook did not have time to go to a3, and of course we do not want to trade this pawn for this pawn because their pawn is much weaker, so we're just going to defend it, and the rook looks a bit like trapped there, but it doesn't matter because it can always escape.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I did underestimate this a bit too much.
So the rook came back to a8, and we're back to a point where we need to find a way to make progress. I think that's usually the hardest thing to do in such type of rook endgames where there's a lot of pawns and you don't really know which breakthrough to go for. But what would you say is next?
Now, I thought like for a second only, because then I have to correct myself, that the rook is trapped on a8, but that's not really true. It actually can move to a7 and a8 all the time. So I cannot really count on anything Zugzwang related yet.
Right.
Now, there's two plans I have in mind. It's either pushing forward the pawns on the other side and and trying to find the second weakness. Or doing a bit more risky maneuver and play a4 and then b5. But a4 doesn't work because the rook can go back to b8 again, as I can see.
Yeah.
And then we have the same problem. And this time it's more difficult to prevent that king c3.
So your plan of two weaknesses was the better plan.
Yes.
There is a specific way to do it even quicker, which you didn't mention yet. But there's a pawn breakthrough which you haven't looked at.
Is there though? Oh, because the rook can shift around. So yeah, then there's actually e4, which is quite clever because it opens it up and the rook can, travel a bit better.
I like a4. It wasn't necessary to play it right away. You could have played a bunch of like h3 or h4 waiting moves.
Yeah.
But the overall plan of this position, I think e4 makes the most sense to all of us because that's how we create another weakness. a6 is a weakness. c6 can be a weakness. It's protected for now. Once the king leaves, we can also bring that back to being a weakness. But the most important thing is that our king, once our king gets to h6, now you can talk about some maybe some zugzwang positions because the rook will have to stay on a7, but more so even your king is just so active that the opponent is going to have nothing to do, and your rook can even shift somehow to attack this pawn, and you're going to win it, and that just wins the game.
Yes.
But this is why the king is trying to come to g5, maybe even not to h6. So you can think about f6 and just being closer to the target pawns. That's all we really needed from this position. So the opponent will play. This is what happened in the game. Played h6 to prevent that king advance. So how do we target the rest?
Okay, that's a very, very interesting lesson once again, because I'm not aware of any of these things again.
Well, this example is just about creating another weakness and the different ways you can do it.
Yeah.
We tried to activate the king. It didn't work, but it also compromised the opponent's pawn structure. So now the pawns are standing with g6 and h6, and they're not protecting each other, which can make it easier to attack them.
Okay, so what about the plan h4 and h5, and then if it gets taken, we take back with the rook. If not, the king just moves to f5, g6. Exactly.
So h4 and h5 is really nice.
Cool.
We can even prepare it with king g4. So we didn't have to play h5 and sacrifice it. Although I think that would also be fine. That would also work. We need to be careful sometimes not to trade too many pawns, but this is fine. We still have 3 of them, and all 3 of black's pawns are big weaknesses. So that is a good thing. So h5 was the right plan. That's how we target these weaknesses. Now black only had pretty much one way left to hold on, and it was a pretty difficult one to think about. It was rook g8, which I think is not too obvious for everyone, but they basically have to play on that like rook activity principle and sacrifice that pawn on a6, so it will fall. But because of the rook activity, it can always be annoying to the g2 pawn and to the king. So something like this would give pretty good drawing chances to black, because now white needs to think of alternative ways to activate his king, to defend the pawn. Still, white is better playing for the win, but this is how these rook endgames, sometimes the way to make a draw is actually to activate your rook and even give up one of your pawns, because as you know, the drawing tendency can also include when you're down a pawn, when you're down 2 pawns, depending on the other things. In the game they played g5, which kind of makes the winning strategy even easier, because now there's a very clear target on h6. So the second that our king gets to f5 and g6, it's going to be done. That's how the rest of the game went. So the king got repositioned to e4. So now the black king has not that many squares to go to. If they allow us to go to f5, it's really bad news for them. So we're gonna play on this idea of two weaknesses. They played around a bit with their pieces, but now that this weakness has been defended, they go for the second weakness, which will not be able to be defended. And also, sometimes in these rook endgames, it's worth calculating the pawn endgames. But for this one, I think we know that it's not going to work for black, and eventually we're going to win one of the pawns, because we actually are the ones that have the opposition. But the opposition, that's already another principle of pawn endgames, which is not exactly in the rook endgames category, but still, this was an example of the two weaknesses and how they can work. So they don't always have to be. It doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes you can just make these improving moves and wait for the opponent to make a mistake. Maybe they will get tired of waiting. That also can be a strategy in some pawn endgames, but in some rook endgames. But especially if you do useful things, if you do useful waiting moves, and do it like here, where you try to create a second weakness, that is a really good strategy. And that is how you win this type of rook endgames, where you have pawns on both sides, but better either rook or king activity. So
interesting. So many little details and so much truth in it, because I mean, but then and you have to calculate it all the time. This is not helping. Oh, this one is famous.
It is. That's why I brought it up.
Alekhine and Capablanca. Wow.
Yep. So this one is famous. It's known. People always talk about it as the example of as the example that you teach rook endgames with.
Yeah.
Because it shows one of those important things that you need to know about rook endgames, which I'm sure you already know. Some people may not know, but once you see this example, it becomes obvious why it's a principle. Do you know which rule I'm talking about? Well, then you can try to think about it in this position, when it's white to move, and what is your next move? That's pretty much.
I'm not 100% sure. I mean, we were talking about endgames one time. And by the way, I apologize for everybody who's watching. It's just how it is, okay? Don't blame me, okay? You also started with chess endgames maybe a bit later than me. Now, I would say rook d1, rook a1.
So you want to put the rook behind the pawn?
Yes.
Which is exactly what this example demonstrated, and that's why often coaches use it as an example for rook endgames to show that the rook is better off behind the pawn. So right now the rook is on the side, which is known to be not the ideal place for the rook, because it's much better off to be behind the pawn. It helps it push itself, because as you can see right now, a6 would not be possible, but had the rook been on a4, that would have been different. So putting the rook behind kind of ties the opponent's rook to being in front of the pawn, which is not a great position to be in, especially if you get kicked out all the way to a8. Then we can talk about zugzwang. It's already really far, and the rook will not be able to move at all. So this rook is kind of stuck. If it ever moves to the side, where the pawn is going to run. If it ever moves behind, the pawn is also going to run. So this is why the rook being behind the pawn is usually the best strategy that you can think about the rook endgames whenever there is a passed pawn. And even if you're the side defending, so the opponent has a passed pawn,
Mhm.
it's very often that you want your pawn, your rook to still be behind the pawn
Yes.
and not allow the opponent's rook to go somewhere else and do other things. So rook behind the pawn always something to remember. That's one of the most important principles of rook endgames. Now you told me rook d1, rook a1, but rook d4 to rook a4, I think I prefer that because we also cut off the opponent's king from ever crossing the fourth rank.
Mhm.
It seems like a tiny detail. I'm sure that in the overall, evaluation of the position doesn't make a difference, but these tiny things can just help during the game because you make the opponent's job a bit harder.
Sure, of course. No, it makes total sense. Yeah. That's quite
So
interesting.
now that the rook is behind the pawn, what is the next goal?
What is the next goal? Maybe to get my king to b5 and attack the rook and then push the pawn forward even more.
Exactly. So if the king gets to b5, we are in really good shape to push the pawn all the way
But
up.
black doesn't let us. What the heck?
But black will try to not let us for quite a while. So we can try some things. They played h5 here, which is going to be important later.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I
But
heard this is very important. I think it was you actually who said that this is a very good pawn setup.
yeah, so it's actually here it ended up being the reason why black lost it. It's not like it's not a mistake per se because the position is winning anyway for white. Maybe I should have asked you if what you think. Is it winning? Is it a draw? But
It's
anyways,
winning
and
for
you
white,
already know
clearly.
now that it should win regardless with the right play. But this h5 just allowed a different allowed a maneuver later on. But this is how you set up the pawns in rook endgames normally, because they're all protecting each other. There's no obvious weaknesses, and the two weaknesses are kind of hard to get to. So that's generally a good way to set up pawns for both sides. It doesn't matter if you're defending or if you're attacking. But we got here, and here's where we start thinking, because we've tried our best to get to b5.
Didn't work.
And it didn't work.
We were too slow.
So what else can we really do?
Now we could attack the pawn on f7 with rook f4, for example.
I think they will play...
Oh, how about going with the rook to e4?
Rook e4?
Yes.
And your idea is what?
To give a check on e5 and yeah.
That if they capture, you want to play rook e5 and go into a pawn endgame.
Yes, which I will win. But of course, black doesn't have to capture. And in the end, we just learned that it is good to have a rook behind the pawn, not on the side.
True. But the pawn endgame, you don't really have to worry about, because even if the black king gets to b5, then you can use your pawn endgame calculation that you're winning in that pawn endgame.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
So they will never be able to capture it as long as your rook is there.
Okay, so in this case, I go to a1 with my rook.
And once again, just a tiny correction that we want to go to a2 just in case to have the f2 defended.
Oh,
but the point of the rook move is to force the black king to make a decision.
Perfect.
Of where he's going. And this is kind of like close-ish to being a Zugzwang, because we have our opposition on the kings. The rook cannot move because the pawn will run forward. And the pawns are stuck in this formation, and any pawn move will result in a different weakness.
There's only 4 spaces the king can go to.
So this move, I think, was pretty important to give the opponent a chance to choose where the king is going. If the king goes to this side,
our king goes to b4.
That will definitely not work because we just gain more space and threatening to go to b5. This is not working at all. The king gets to b5 and even better.
Good.
But the king will go to b5.
Okay,
and
so
from
in this
here
case,
what will we do?
We go to d4 with our king and win the pawn endgame if it would be exchanged. My opinion.
Yeah, so now black can never capture. That's a good point. That's the pawn endgame is lost. And we go king to d4. Where is your king going to go next?
I would say e5.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
But the rook is still here, so you're not getting really to f6.
Yeah. So, no, that's not working.
I'll help you with the next move.
Oh, it was the right one, e5. Okay, I thought I was thinking about the different one than e5, and this was a bit confusing for me.
No, e5 is good.
Well, yes, of course, I would have played f4 and then g5 and then h6. So, yeah, that was the original plan.
We can go to g7. So that's
was
nice.
A misunderstanding. Sorry.
That's a nice plan. And now you see why I said something about the h5 move, is because had the pawn been on h6, this plan wouldn't have worked. Some other plan would have worked. Maybe h5 would have been possible there, but still. This allows for this nice king maneuver, and we could kind of put it into the principle of two weaknesses as well, because we can count our passed pawn as the opponent's weakness.
Oh,
but
okay.
This is just playing on both sides of the board, and it's it's not exactly as much of an example as the previous one.
And now we know why Rook a2 was so important, because of a check
it was
on f6.
Useful. I think it doesn't change the overall. You can always, the good thing about these when you're on the winning side of things
you can
is
make
that
moves.
You can, unless you really like mess up and transpose into a bad pawn structure for yourself or a bad type of pawn endgame, you really will not be at the risk of making a draw or at the risk of losing, as long as you don't make any huge blunders. So you can kind of move back and forth sometimes, gain some time, and see what the opponent does, and then figure out your own plan. But you can't sit around forever. If you do want to win, you have to try to prove it. Okay, so I think one of the last moments is what was going to happen if black tried to prevent us from advancing with f6.
I would say we just force a6.
Force what?
We play a6.
A6, exactly. So that's a really good move.
I don't know why I said force, but yeah, we just force the capture of a6. That was the
exactly main idea. And now
wait a second. Boop, boop, boop. Yeah, e4, d5, and e6.
Yeah, so the point is that the king is just one square too far from making it to the defense, and we are going to d5 and to e6 and winning these pawns. So that pawn endgame is winning, and that's how you win it. So in the game, f6 didn't happen, and it was just a bit of a slower play here, but it's still the exact idea that we talked about. They just played f4. It didn't change much, but the king wants to go to g7. So eventually it does. Now you see the rook went to a3 to make sure that it's defending the pawn.
Yes, I thought about this for a second. Yeah,
that's a nice thing about the rook behind the pawn, is that you have a lot of space too. So you can do lots of different things. So the king went to g7, and we're now attacking the other weakness. So once we have done that, we can target this pawn chain in a few ways. There's a few winning ways. I like the way of f5. That's what happened in the game. So we're disconnecting the pawns now. So once that happens, we're gonna win like both f5 and h5, or both of them. So that's what happened in the game, and it was a temporary pawn sacrifice that Alekhine did, because he was going to win one of the pawns back anyways, and it ended up black sacrificed it back. But this position is already winning, just because you can even see the difference between the kings, and the rook keeps doing its thing of defending.
b5.
Now we're threatening to transpose into a favorable pawn endgame. So we always use these tactical ideas in combination. And eventually he just calculated that he was going to win one of the pawns, and that it's not one. This is not one of the. Do you remember we did a lesson on the H and the F pawn?
Yes.
So that's known to be like a drawn, like a very, like a theoretically drawn endgame, but it's difficult in practice.
Yeah.
But this is not. This is not the same, even though black has an extra pawn. This is not the same. Do you have an idea why it's not the same?
The king is clearly too far away, and it is the most important part in this.
The king is too far, and that's one of the most important factors here. Had the king been on g7, that would have been different.
Oh, yes.
Then we could talk a lot about the draw, and that would have been highly likely. But now that the king is so far, we just win that pawn, and then we separate the king from being able to come back.
Very nice.
And that's another thing that's another tool that rooks use a lot in these rook endgames. If the king is far, you try to just separate it, and that's an effective skill that the rooks have, and you do it in no matter how many pawns there are. Always good to cut the opponent off from the side that is being worked on. Even this game, it says it was adjourned here because it was going on so long. But this was back in the day where they were, I guess, adjourning games.
Have you ever had an adjourning game? No, of course not, right?
Me, no. I'm too young.
Yeah. When did it stop? In the 90s sometime. Yeah, I had a couple of adjourned games. Such a weird. It was so odd. It was difficult for me to understand because I was quite young, and yeah.
Computers weren't as integrated in chess yet, right?
No, exactly. That was the thing. So a computer could give good moves and good ideas and even help you, but after all, it was like it was probably better to have some clever or smart players to help you with an adjourned game, because that was totally legit. Like to think with other people together of what is the best move.
Some people like if you're playing a world championship match, I bet you have the whole team. Thinking all night about which move you're going to play tomorrow.
That was like the very big thing for Russia at one point.
Yeah, but that was an interesting part of history. Probably good thing that it doesn't happen anymore, because it would not be possible nowadays. But still interesting. So, if we have time for another one,
yes, we have. And what a nice game you have chosen.
Have you seen it before?
No, but I remember, and I think I heard of it. So this was Firouzja against Mamedyarov, and we just before we had Alekhine and Capablanca, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we cannot compare those to Capablanca and Alekhine, but they're still just massively two of the strong top 10 players in the world too, after all.
And this was the tournament where I think this was the tournament where Firouzja was just beating everyone and crossing 2800. And this one was an interesting game for a different reason. I'll get to the position that was always in the talks. It basically transposed into another game. It was the exact same position, except Mamedyarov didn't find a way to draw. So Mamedyarov was trying to draw this game as black. But the previous game, it did go in the draw route.
Okay.
So I'll just play the few moves of how we got there. So eventually we are getting to 2 pawns against 1 pawn. Have you heard of these type of endgames before?
Well, yes, I have, because this morning I had 2 larger recordings with Carsten Müller's Endgame Magic, and we had exactly this example. Also, I watched Carsten Müller and Tikhon Tsarnaev, and they did in the first 3 or 4 games, they were talking about nothing else than 2 pawns against 0 pawns, even how to draw that, or 2 pawns against 1
pawn. The pawns are separated?
They were even together, and it was still, it completely depended on the situation, but there were even draw abilities there to keep the draw. Yeah. So very interesting.
2 versus 1, how realistic do you think winning chances are in these?
Well, it depends, but slim, because black always has some very good drawing chances after all.
Yeah, especially, so I think usually the way I think about it, whenever I have the 2 pawns on the one side of the board, that kind of increases the drawing chances. Whenever it's like, if let's say the opponent's pawn is somewhere on the queen side and we have the 2 connected passers, I think that increases the winning chances when the pawns are connected and not interfered by the opponent's pawn. But when it's on one side of the board, it becomes difficult because you can't really promote one pawn without making that one exchange. And the second that one of like a pair of pawns gets traded, one pawn doesn't win, and you already know that because of the Philidor position, right?
Yes, I know about that. But yeah, we will
Don't
talk about that one day. Again. I'm pretty sure about the Philidor.
We have looked at it, and you will definitely remember if it occurs to you
I
that
think so.
It's a draw. With only one pawn, it is always a draw, unless, I don't know, some strange situation where it works out tactically. But one pawn should draw, especially when the king is close. So that's why in these 2 pawns versus 1 pawn on one side of the board, very difficult to win this by promoting one of your pawns. It's just hard to push it forward. But still, of course, one person, white in this case, is going to try to play for a win because you have an extra pawn, so you have absolutely the right to keep it going. So the way of defense for black, you've seen the exact example, haven't you?
Not the exact one, a similar one, but it wasn't that one, no.
Okay. So the way to defend for black is usually you try to see what is white's winning plan. So what do you think is the white's kind of winning plan here? Even it's not necessary to have rook b3 there, but in an ideal scenario, in which case do you think white will start to be winning here?
Yeah, okay, I gotcha. Okay, so yeah, probably if the white king manages to move forward enough, I guess e3 to exchange on e4 or something like that. Yeah, I would say that's
true. So if the king gets to e3, that's good indication that the pawn will be very weak and might be won. Even I think the more dangerous one is just the king getting out through h3, g4, f4. So h3, maybe g4, f4 is actually the square that we want.
Yeah.
And that is not only dependent on capturing the e4 pawn, but also we want to push our own g pawn. So the farther it gets, the harder the defense becomes. So I think if the king gets out to g4 and to f4, it's going to become almost impossible to hold, and you will end up losing the pawn somewhere. So that's what white's plan should look like. Rook went to b3. There's a lot of ways to play these. There's different techniques. Rook b3 makes sense because you're cutting off the king on the 3rd rank, so your plan with king e2 and king e3 doesn't work anymore. He still played king e2. And the rook stayed on the 3rd rank for a while. We often use these waiting techniques just to see what is the opponent going to do, how is he going to break through. So there's no reason for black to try to break through anything because it's up to white to find the winning plan.
This is always this moment. This terrible situation when, well, you have this pawn more and it's a winning position, and now you just have to prove it. That is always tough.
But here the point is, usually in those rook endgames, it's actually not a winning position, and you have to get these winning chances, try to trick.
Okay.
And that's, I think, even harder than just winning a position when it is winning.
Yes. And Carlsen is the best example for that, right? Always.
Yeah, for sure. He's good. He's really good at it. He's known for it. So this was the moment of truth in this game where it was black's chance to make a draw. And this was the interesting position where, so Mamedyarov didn't find it. He played something else and ended up losing the game. But there's one way here to make that draw. And this exact same position appeared in the game between Teichmann against Alekhine in Prague 1908. So over 100 years ago, but these two are very good players. You know, the Alekhine opening right against the Sicilian, e4, c5, c3. So he was obviously a good player. I hope that's him. At least if the game is famous, then it must be him. But it's funny that the exact same position, exact same thing appeared over 100 years ago. And in that game, Black did find a defense. But here, history repeated itself, but the defense wasn't found. So you try to find it for Black. A defensive move that solves all the problems.
Dear people at home, the same applies to you, of course. If you know all of this already, well, congrats, you are a step further than, for example, myself and a lot of other people. If you do not know it yourself, this is the chance to learn a lot, I guess. I am, the whole time, I'm trying to calculate Rook to f3. But I think this can only be a loss for Black. Black cannot hold this pawn on f3. Black cannot sneak around on d3 or e2, and because the pawn on g4 will just start and become
So why
queen.
do you not like? You don't like Rook f3 because of the pawn endgame?
Yes.
So let's see it.
King
here,
King e1. I will play white.
King e1, okay. I will play King e4.
King d2.
I will play King d4.
Now g4.
King e4.
And g5. And now King e... Oh. Yeah, King e3.
King e3, sure.
And King takes f3. Oh, it is a draw. Or is it King... Yeah, this is a draw, right? Yeah.
It is. I think it's a bit of it's a bit of a long calculation, which is why I wanted to do it on the board. And the thing is, this factor of opposition becomes really, really important here.
Yes, indeed.
Because that can be a matter between a win and a draw. So even though the king is in front of the pawn, which is favorable for the side with an extra pawn, if it cannot advance, then it doesn't actually help its pawn. So the opposition will be kept, and now the king is either forced to go back or the pawn goes forward. And once the pawn goes forward like that, then we already know that this is a clear draw, as long as you know the tiny rule that you have to go back in front of the pawn, instead of to the side and give away the opposition. As long as you know that rule, this is a simple draw. But it is not so simple to see it all the way from here and to know that you will for sure have that opposition and and get there. So in the game Teichmann against Alekhine, this did happen. They did play Rook f6.
So my instinct was correct. But that's the thing. Yeah, correct. But I shouldn't rely on instincts. I just have to calculate it a bit longer, a bit more. And then I know for sure.
Yeah, so Rook f3 was good. And if king goes to g1, so tries to go through the other way,
that won't work.
The only thing you need to do is not let it out to h3. So king g4.
Oh, okay. I even
these
thought
are kind of corresponding squares. So whenever the second the king goes to h2, you have to be on g4.
Oh, this is important. Because I thought the actual plan of Black would be to go to e2.
No, the actual plan, I think, is just to not let the king out.
Yeah, which is far, far easier. It's super easy after all, yeah.
Yeah, so then the king has to go back and we come back to the same situation with king to e1. Wow. So that was the way to draw. You found it really quickly. That was the first move that you looked at.
At least, yeah, because I thought this yeah, I think maybe I seen it once or twice or something.
You might have, because this was
it's a famous
example. Big win for Firouzja, and it was funny that this exact position has appeared before in a relatively top level game. So the other idea of Rook f3, which is what we've mentioned before. So if the rook, let's say, goes away, this is actually what happened in that 1908 game, but the way that it draws, of course, if white calculated it enough, they're not going to go for a pawn endgame and they would rather play a rook endgame still. And the point of that is that the king is now stuck to the defense of the f2 pawn. So rook f8 was really smart because it defended f2 and it allows the king to go king g2, king h3, king g4 and get to that, just get the king out. But here it's not possible. Once you play rook f3 and force the rook out, now the rook is on its ideal square and the king has no way of advancing. You can try to play rook d2 through making your rook slightly more passive and try to advance the king, but it still doesn't work because eventually you will let the opponent's king to d4.
That is so crazy.
If it wants, but this is how the game went, and there's actually nothing else, not much left to do. And eventually white did try pushing the pawn, etc., but it ended up being still a draw. And it wasn't enough to win. In the Firouzja and Mamedyarov game, he played king d4.
Okay.
And and the thing is, you can't play a waiting move either because king g2, king h3.
G2, king h3.
And that's different. He played king d4, and the game just went on. A few more moves. The king went to h3, pawn pushed to g4.
Oh, that's clever too.
And I think that was the end of it. Looks like
Rook
that was it, and he even just resigned. Because there's not much else to defend, and once the king gets out, it just becomes hard. So he missed the chance with rook f3, but it was an instructive moment, and it's a nice trick to know. And we also did a bit of pawn endgames there.
Indeed we did, it's so great. I'm learning so much. Why do I always forget the things I'm learning? That's a bit of a problem. But it's a couple of more times I will see this, and then I think I can remember it.
No, but that tends to happen with endgames a lot, that if you don't review them, you will forget. But some things might stay there. So whenever you look at the examples of rook endgames, it's not like you're going to have the exact same one in your game.
Yes.
Although, as we saw, some examples repeat, but you will not have the same one. So the most important is just to get the key ideas, know some of these rules, like rook behind the pawn, and that's all you need to know. And that's how you will play your own games. There's no need to remember actual move by move, because it will not be the same position
all the time anyway. And I mean, I'm happy that I learned a bit of endgames in the last year, because it really helped me by winning one game over the board, where I had one rook against 3 pawns. And I actually thought, before I got told by Carsten Müller himself, that this is clearly a win for rook often enough. And I was like, oh, really? Wow, that's a surprise. So with this...
And then you got it in your own game?
With this, I got it in my own game, and I was forcing the rook exchange, because I knew, okay, I have a rook against 3 pawns, this will win. So, with this, it'll help. And these are those small little steps which you get in your end games, and then you will try them out on the board. Hopefully for you. Pandemic is getting less and less, really, maybe, fingers crossed. So let's hope we can all get over the board or on the board and play some real games. Thank you so much, Svitlana. Thanks everybody for watching. Thank you for your like. I'm counting today. So see you guys soon. Bye-bye.